In 1938, I joined the National Guard. Every 3 months, I'd get a check for $12. We were put into federal service February 10th, 1941. We took the place of the regular Army. Regular Army at that time was only 125,000 in all of the United States. The start of the draft, so they had to have people in the Army that were already trained to train the people from the draft. That's why the National Guard was taken. We were trained as soldiers. We went down to Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. That was February 10th, 1941. Went into training there, infantry training, for 5 months. And June, I got appendicitis, and before I got to the hospital, it burst on me. So I got a little time at home called sick leave. When I went back, somebody had been looking at my service record and saw that I could type. Well, no longer was I an infantry soldier. I was transferred to headquarters company of the 135th Infantry Regiment as their company clerk, and I became a corporal. While I was going there, doing everything by myself, I got to looking at the tables of organization. Tables of organization tell you, hey, the company clerk of headquarters company is supposed to be a sergeant and have a corporal helper. I was a corporal with no helper. So when I brought this up to Captain Erickson, our commanding officer, he said, well, I gave your rating to one of my friends and I just can't take it back, so you'll have to do without being a sergeant, and I'll get you a helper, he said. So he got me a corporal helper that couldn't type. That's a good way to make points with your company clerk. Then December 7th came along. The Japanese hit Pearl Harbor. I didn't even know where Pearl Harbor was at the time until they mentioned it was in Hawaii. Well, that changed everything. Our commanding officer then of the 135th Infantry Regiment was a full bird colonel, Colonel Schmidt. He came out and talked to the company clerks and said, I've decided to give everyone who hasn't had a furlough in the past year a 15-day furlough back to Minnesota. So he said, you go tell your commanding officer that I'm offering this to make aware that it's authorized. So my commanding officer, Captain Erickson, said, Corporal, you go up to headquarters and check the records and see who hasn't had a furlough in the past year, and you make them out for 7 days. I said, 7 days, sir? We're 1,000 miles from Minnesota. This is the middle of winter. By the time you make it back to Minnesota, it'll be 3 days, and you'll just have to turn around and come back. He says, Corporal, I'm the commanding officer of this unit. He says, you do as you're told. He says, yes, sir. Oh, I went up, checked the records. I found out about 55 guys hadn't had furlough in the past year, and Corporal Jake Larson was one of them. Well, it's a funny thing about that typewriter. When I typed out my furlough papers, instead of all the rest of them, I put 7 in there. In the typewriter, I didn't really realize it, typed 15 in there. Well, they all had to be signed by Captain Erickson, so I took them down and had them signed, and he was one stickler for checking everything. But when he got down to 3/4 of them, he just signed them. And of course, that's where I had mine stuck. As quick as I took them up, Colonel Schmidt said, make out a stencil. Colonel Schmidt signed the stencil with all these different names on there. It became official. I had a 15-day furlough back home. So I rode with my 2 cousins who were still in Company F back to Minnesota. And after 7 days, the postmaster came to our place and said, I have a telegram for Jake. And I said, you weren't able to locate me, Joe Slazak. He says, no, never saw you, so he left. So I rode back to Camp Claiborne. We made it back, and Captain Erickson, quick as I came in, he reached up and pulled my corporal stripes off of me, and he says, "You're transferred to the wire section. You'll be climbing poles and stringing wire from now on." I said, "Thank you, sir." And he says, "I should court-martial you." I says, "I'd like to know the reason you'd court-martial me." He says, "For forging my name." I says, "I'd welcome that." I said, "Because every one of those furloughs were signed by you personally, and all I have to do is bring them all together." "Well, anyway," he says, "you're going to the wire section. You'll be climbing poles and stringing wire." For 2 weeks, I was thinking about that, and the next thing I knew, we were shipped to Fort Dix, New Jersey, for going overseas. So, waiting for a ship, my 2 cousins and we went to New York City, and we had in a convoy on the Aquitania over to Europe. We were headed for North Ireland. We were about 30 miles out of Belfast. And I thought, well, Jake, you'll be climbing poles and stringing wire now. The next thing I knew, I was temporarily transferred to a replacement depot that was transferring Americans that had joined the Canadian forces and British forces before we got into the war, and transferring them back into our service at the ranks they were in the Canadian forces or the English forces. Our forces paid more money. You didn't have to tempt them very much to get them in there. My job was to sell them GI insurance, Private Jake Larson, the insurance salesman. I had a staff sergeant, Sergeant Robert Jeffrey, and a corporal, William R. Cray, and myself. We ran the whole thing. So that dried up after about 35 days, and we went back to our units, and I thought, well, here, I'll be climbing poles and stringing wire. And 3 days later, I was transferred to G3 of 5th Corps. A corps has got 2 divisions under it. I didn't know what G3 was, even operations and plans and training. They put me to the test. I had this Master Sergeant, Bill Ellery was his name. He gave me a bunch of stuff. He says, "I want you to type this up." I just grabbed it and sat down to the typewriter, and I was used to the Army, coming from a headquarters company clerk. So I just went through that like a cyclone and took it back up to him. And he said, "You did this already?" "Yeah." He says, "Well, here's something else here. You can do this." Pretty soon, I was in on the big stuff. That was just test material that he passed up. And it wasn't 2 months after I was there, I was promoted to corporal. And then I got put in charge of the tables of organization, which is quite a collection when you get to thinking the old Army. As far as you could reach, there were books filed in, and each one of those TOs, we call them, tables of organization, you had to take that apart in order to get that one out of there. The Pentagon, at that time, we were under World War I stuff, so they updated it, made the units bigger, assigned Garand rifles and helmets and everything. So it was quite a chore to keep those up to date. And Colonel Hill was a stickler on keeping those up to date. When he saw that I was doing a good job, he promoted me to sergeant. So I don't think I was in 5th Corps 5 or 6 months before I became a sergeant. And I worked as a sergeant with him, even when he took me to Portsmouth. And that's where the invasion was planned. And I did all the typing and making up, mimeographing all the copies that I'd typed, and making books that we could send out to the units that were under our command. And Little did I think that after I got out of the service in 1945, he had me come back to Fort Snelling and accept a Bronze Star for the work I did on the invasion. Quite a jump for a little infantry guy from a farm boy in Hope, Minnesota, to influencing the landing on D-Day. In an infantry regiment, you can't get any lower than the way I started. An infantry soldier is about the lowest thing there is in rank. How I ever got into G3 of 5th Corps is amazing.